If you're a research student, gather here. This is for you. If you're writing a dissertation, if you're writing a thesis, if you're doing undergraduate project work, your final piece after completing your program, this is for you. Listen to me. You cannot begin your dissertation or your thesis or your project by writing the introductory chapter. You cannot. It doesn't make any sense. And I'll prove to you today, just by showing and sharing with you the key elements of your introductory chapter to support my argument that no, you don't write your first chapter first. Actually, you write it last. Welcome. This is my channel. My name is Dr. Sarah Chidiberejo. Here, I share research tips, I bring information around the world of academia, and I bring my fabulous lifestyle. I bring gist to you from out of Nigeria and around the world. This is the channel to be. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. Just press the button. It will cost you nothing. It will not cost you any 1 naira. It will cost you anything. Just subscribe and like my content. Share it with your friends. We share relevant content here. This is not for jokes. Yes, we laugh, we have fun. I share content about my students and we have a good time. But what we share here is life altering for good. So please subscribe now. Today, we're going to talk about this thing. It's a problem to me. How institutions, faculties, departments compel their students to submit their introductory chapter first. How is that even possible? When you think about it and you really read through your work and you ask yourself, what is the first chapter of my thesis supposed to contain? And how am I supposed to write it? And then you take it back and you say, how am I supposed to write this introductory chapter, which is supposed to be a summary of the entire thing I have done first? Remember, your introductory chapter is the first chapter of your work that anybody who picks up your piece of art will look at, will read. So, if it's supposed to summarize everything you have done, how do you then write it even before you start the research itself? Okay, so let's just break it down. Your introductory chapter is supposed to begin by having a background information. Correct, right? Yes. Your background information is supposed to be somewhat a kind of storytelling, historical context, a breakdown of your key concepts, an introduction somehow into the literature you'll be working with, some kind of generic information that will allow people who are not in your neck of woods or your supervisors or your school to immediately understand what this work is about, what your research is about. If there's no basic background, for instance, you're doing your research on political violence. I mean, you can think that everyone knows what political violence is, but when you look at the literature, you see that there are particular definitions. So, before you write your background information, which is a critical part of your chapter 1, you must have read something. That means you must have looked through literature first. So imagine someone who's been asked to submit their chapter 1, and the person has not looked through the literature regarding that field, regarding that subject. What will the person write? It will just be guesswork. And by the time you submit that kind of work, you find that your supervisor is struggling because they don't even know what you're talking about. They don't know the origin. They may be vast in the field. But when they pick up your work to see whether you're making sense, it is tough. You can imagine somebody doing a piece of work about Boko Haram without giving us some context about what Boko Haram is. Or you're writing a work on terrorism. You've not told us what terrorism is, what the definitions are, what the kind of history, and why it is even relevant, which is a critical part of your introduction. Imagine that happening without having done a bit of digging around what other people have said about the subject. So, your background information does not even happen. You can't write it effectively without having looked through your literature. The second thing that we do in terms of writing an introduction is to show rationale for the work. You want to establish what the research problem is. What is the issue you're tackling? And why is it relevant? Why should we care? Why should anyone who picks up your work bother with it? Why is it important? You can imagine writing that part of your chapter 1 without having looked through the literature, without having gone through to say, okay, this problem may have been, or maybe you're encountering it for the first time, without realizing that a lot of work has been done on it already. You can imagine somebody coming to say, well, I want to do a research around NSAS. You may be encountering that label for the first time, but there are people who may have written a lot about it. And so for you to show cause for your work, to establish that there's a rationale for your own research, you need to go see what the other people have done. Once again, you have to go back to your literature. And as you're looking through the texts, you're writing, you're putting resources together, you're eliminating, you're evaluating, you're synthesizing what people have said. Because it is until you do that you begin to think about what your research objectives are and what your research questions are, which are a critical part of your research introductory chapter. If you don't know the right questions to ask, you may end up asking a question that's already been answered. If you don't know what the real objectives are of your research, you may find that you're just walking around in circles without knowing what your research objective is, or objectives are, or the questions you want to answer. How will you then determine the kind of methodology to apply, or the kind of method to use to answer or resolve whatever problem you're tackling? How is that possible? So once again, whether it is you're introducing a little bit or telling us about your method, your methodology, your philosophical position, it's important that you go first and you look at the literature to establish what others have done. Another part of the introduction is the significance, why your work is important, and who will it affect, what organizations, what people. Without looking at the literature to establish what has been done and how what has been done has been applied in different industries or sectors, how will you show cause for your work? Because if you just say, oh, it's relevant to students, a good supervisor will ask you, and you think the one written by this other person is not good for students? What am I trying to establish here? The idea that students have to be compelled to produce their introductory chapter just because they appears first is a flawed method. It's a flawed approach. Yes, you get to write your introduction. It's important that when people pick up your work, the first chapter they read is your introduction. But that doesn't mean you have to write it first. What you do, and I argue strongly for this, is that you go look at your literature, do your literature review. Because it's only by doing your literature review, coming up with an annotated bibliography, looking at the relevant text in that area, that you'll be able to determine whether this work is worth doing in the first instance. Is this research important? Has enough been said about it? If enough has not been said, what more can be said? Because remember, a critical part of your evaluation is determining whether or not you're filling a gap in knowledge. And so if the knowledge in that area is saturated or you cannot significantly prove that there's a gap, you fail. And your work will be thrown through the dustbin. It's irrelevant. I encourage you today as a researcher, whether you're budding or established, to think around this. Think about it again. And begin to encourage students all around the world, especially in Nigeria, to go do your literature review first. Establish what is there and what is not. Get knowledgeable. Be aware of what has been said so that you can know what is missing and therefore fill it. My name is Dr. Sarah Chidiberenjo, and this is my channel. I hope that this information has been useful. See you again next time. Bye.